I never thought my own sister would be the one to almost kill me. But sometimes the people closest to you are the ones who hurt you the most. My name is Elizabeth Morrison, and this is the story of how a family dinner turned into a nightmare that would expose the ugly truth about the people I trusted most. What happened that night in our suburban Phoenix home didn't just nearly cost me my life, it revealed a pattern of manipulation and favoritism that had been brewing for years. And when the hospital documentation proved what really happened, my parents' reaction was the most shocking part of all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in the Morrison household felt like living in two different worlds, depending on which daughter you were looking at. I'm Elizabeth, 22 years old, and I've spent most of my life watching my parents bend over backwards for my older sister Charlotte while treating me like an afterthought. Our house on Maple Street in Scottsdale was picture perfect from the outside. Manicured lawn, two-car garage, the kind of place where neighbors would wave and comment on how lovely the Morrison family seemed. But inside those cream-colored walls, there was an invisible scoreboard where Charlotte always came out on top. Charlotte was 25, 3 years my senior, and everything my parents seemed to want in a daughter. She was studying to be a nurse practitioner at Arizona State University, had perfect attendance at family dinners, and could do no wrong in my mother Patricia's eyes. My father Robert, an accounting manager at a mid-sized firm downtown, would light up whenever Charlotte walked into a room, asking about her studies, her boyfriend Derek, her future plans. Meanwhile, I was working part-time at a local bookstore while taking community college courses, trying to figure out my path without the financial support Charlotte had always received. The favoritism wasn't subtle. When Charlotte needed a car for nursing school, Dad co-signed for a brand new Honda Civic. When I asked for help with a used Toyota that cost half as much, I was told to learn responsibility and save up myself. When Charlotte struggled with organic chemistry, they hired a private tutor. When I needed help with my math courses, I was handed a library card and told to figure it out. Every Christmas, every birthday, every achievement was measured differently, depending on which daughter had earned it. But the most significant difference between Charlotte and me wasn't our parents' treatment. It was my severe allergy to shellfish. Diagnosed when I was 8 years old after a terrifying reaction to shrimp at a family restaurant, I carried an EpiPen everywhere I went. The allergic reaction had been dramatic enough that it was seared into everyone's memory, or so I thought. My throat had closed up, hives covered my entire body, and I'd nearly died before the paramedics arrived. Since then, I'd been religious about reading ingredient lists, asking restaurants about cross-contamination, and always having my auto-injector within reach. My family knew about my allergy. They'd lived through that first incident with me. Mom had been the one holding my hand in the emergency room while the doctors explained how serious shellfish allergies could be. Dad had been the one to learn how to use the EpiPen, just in case. Charlotte had even done a school presentation on food allergies the following year, using me as her primary example. There was no way anyone in my family could claim ignorance about my condition. Yet somehow over the years, my allergy had become more of an inconvenience to everyone else than a serious medical condition. Family restaurant choices were made without considering my dietary restrictions. Holiday meals featured shrimp cocktail as appetizers, with my concerns brushed off as being dramatic. When I'd bring my own food to family gatherings to be safe, I was accused of being antisocial or difficult. The EpiPen I carried became a source of eye rolls and sighs, as if I was choosing to be allergic just to make things complicated for everyone else. Charlotte, in particular, seemed to view my allergy as an attention-seeking behavior. She'd make comments about how I was lucky to have something that made me special or interesting. During her nursing studies, she'd occasionally correct me about my own medical condition, citing textbook knowledge over my lived experience. She had a way of making everything about her, even my potentially life-threatening allergy. The dynamics in our house had been building to something for months before that night in March.
I'd started to notice more tension whenever I was around, more whispered conversations between Charlotte and our parents that would stop abruptly when I entered the room. There are family plans made without consulting me, decisions about holidays and gatherings where my input wasn't sought. I felt like I was slowly being edged out of my own family, becoming more of a peripheral member than a daughter and sister. I'd been working extra shifts at the bookstore, partly because I needed the money for school, but mostly because home didn't feel welcoming anymore. Mrs. Henderson, who owned the shop, had become more of a maternal figure to me than my own mother. She'd ask about my classes, remember details about my goals, and actually listened when I talked about wanting to study literature and maybe become a teacher someday. The stark contrast between how valued I felt at work versus at home was becoming harder to ignore.
My relationship with Charlotte had been deteriorating steadily. What used to be typical sibling rivalry had evolved into something more toxic. She'd borrow my clothes without asking, use my car when hers was being serviced without permission, and somehow always position herself as the victim when confronted. Our parents consistently sided with her, explaining away her behavior as stress from nursing school or relationship troubles with Derek. My complaints were dismissed as jealousy or immaturity. The week before the incident, Charlotte had failed an important exam in her pharmacology class. She'd been in a particularly foul mood, snapping at everyone and making sarcastic comments about my easy community college courses compared to her real education. Mom had been fussing over her, making her favorite foods and suggesting she take a break from studying. Dad had even offered to pay for additional tutoring, despite the fact that they'd refused to help me with my much less expensive educational expenses just months earlier. I'd been looking forward to our family dinner that Sunday night in March. Despite everything, I still held on to hope that we could find our way back to being a real family. Mom had promised to make her famous lasagna, which was always a safe dish for me since it contained no shellfish. Charlotte seemed to be in a better mood. Having retaken her exam earlier that week, Dad had been less stressed about work lately. For once, it felt like we might actually enjoy each other's company without the usual undercurrent of tension. I should have known it was too good to be true. In the Morrison family, peaceful moments were usually just the calm before the storm. But I was tired of always being on guard. Tired of anticipating the next slight or dismissal. That Sunday, I decided to just be hopeful, to believe that maybe we could have one normal family dinner without any drama or complications. I had no idea that by the end of that evening, everything I thought I knew about my family would be shattered. I had no idea that Charlotte's resentment had grown into something dangerous. And I certainly had no idea that the very people who were supposed to protect me would choose to protect her instead, even when faced with undeniable evidence of what she'd done. That Sunday dinner would change everything. It would force me to see my family for who they really were, not who I'd always hoped they could be, and it would set in motion a series of events that would ultimately teach me that sometimes the most important family you can have is the one you choose for yourself. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Sunday, March 15th started like any other family dinner day, but there was an energy in the air that I couldn't quite place. I arrived at my parents' house around 4 in the afternoon, bringing a bottle of sparkling cider and a small bouquet of daisies for Mom, gestures I hoped might help set a positive tone for the evening. The Arizona sun was just beginning to soften, casting long shadows across the desert landscaping that Dad meticulously maintained every weekend. Charlotte's car was already in the driveway when I pulled up, which was unusual since she typically arrived fashionably late to family gatherings. As I walked through the front door, I could hear animated conversation coming from the kitchen. Charlotte was standing at the island, gesturing enthusiastically while Mom hung on her every word. Dad sat at the breakfast bar, nodding approvingly at whatever story Charlotte was telling. "Elizabeth," Mom called out when she noticed me, "Charlotte was just telling us about her clinical rotation at St. Joseph's Hospital. She got to assist with a cardiac procedure yesterday." I smiled and congratulated Charlotte, genuinely trying to be supportive despite the familiar pang of being overshadowed. "That sounds amazing. How did it go?" Charlotte's eyes lit up as she launched into a detailed description of the procedure, using medical terminology that she clearly enjoyed displaying. She talked about how the attending physician had complimented her technique, how she'd correctly anticipated the next steps before being asked, and how several nurses had commented on her natural aptitude. Mom and Dad listened with rapt attention, asking follow-up questions and expressing their pride. When Charlotte finished her story, there was a brief lull in conversation. I started to mention that I had been selected to help with the bookstore's upcoming literary festival, but Charlotte quickly pivoted to discussing her upcoming final exams. The moment for my news had passed, swallowed up by yet another Charlotte achievement. As Mom began preparing dinner, I noticed something odd. Instead of her usual lasagna preparation, she was working with what looked like a cream sauce and appeared to be incorporating seafood. My stomach clenched as I watched her add what looked suspiciously like pieces of lobster to the mixture. "Mom," I said carefully, "what are we having tonight? I thought you were making lasagna." "Oh, I changed my mind," she replied without looking up from her cooking. "Charlotte requested her favorite seafood Alfredo. She's been so stressed with school, and she retook that pharmacology exam, so I thought we'd celebrate." I felt a chill run through me. "Mom, you know I can't eat that. I'm severely allergic to shellfish, remember?" Charlotte looked over from where she was setting the table. "God, Elizabeth, everything doesn't have to revolve around your allergy. Can't we have one meal that's not dictated by your dietary restrictions?" "I'm not trying to dictate anything," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I just need to know what I can and can't eat. It's literally a matter of life and death for me." Dad sighed heavily from his position at the bar. "Maybe you could just pick around the seafood, sweetheart. Your mother went to a lot of trouble to make Charlotte's favorite dish." I stared at him in disbelief. "Pick around it, Dad? Cross-contamination is a real thing. Even trace amounts could trigger a reaction. I can't believe we're having this conversation." Mom turned from the stove, her expression annoyed rather than concerned. "Elizabeth, you're being dramatic again. I'll make you a separate plate of plain pasta. Problem solved." But I could see the irritation in her movements, the way she slammed the cabinet door when retrieving another pot, the exaggerated sighs as she began boiling water for my special meal. Charlotte smirked from across the kitchen, clearly enjoying the tension she had created with her dinner request. "Actually," Charlotte said, her voice taking on a helpful tone that I immediately distrusted, "I learned about allergen protocols in my clinical training. Elizabeth's right about cross-contamination being dangerous, but there are ways to handle it safely." She moved toward the stove where Mom was working. "Here, let me help. I know exactly how to separate everything properly so Elizabeth can eat with us." I watched nervously as Charlotte took over portions of the cooking process. She seemed to know what she was doing, carefully using separate utensils and pans, explaining to Mom about preventing cross-contamination. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope that maybe Charlotte was actually looking out for me for once. "See," Charlotte said, presenting me with a plate of what appeared to be plain fettuccine Alfredo. Completely separate preparation. No seafood came anywhere near this. I looked down at the plate, then at Charlotte's confident smile. Something felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on what it was. The pasta looked identical to everyone else's, just without the obvious chunks of lobster. The sauce appeared the same creamy white color. "Are you sure this is safe?" I asked. "The sauce looks exactly like everyone else's." "Elizabeth, I made it myself using completely separate ingredients. I'm literally studying to be a healthcare professional. Do you really think I don't understand the severity of allergy reactions?"
Mom nodded approvingly. Charlotte knows what she's doing, dear. She's been learning all about this in school. We all sat down to eat, and I found myself staring at my plate with growing anxiety. Something didn't feel right, but I couldn't articulate what it was. The pasta smelled delicious, and I was hungry after a long shift at the bookstore that morning. Charlotte was watching me expectantly, along with my parents. "What are you waiting for?" Dad asked. "Charlotte went to all that trouble to make sure you could eat safely." I picked up my fork, still hesitating. "Charlotte, you swear this is completely separate from the seafood?" "Elizabeth, for crying out loud," Charlotte snapped. "Yes, I swear. I use different pans, different utensils, everything. Stop being so paranoid." Feeling pressured and not wanting to create more family drama, I took a small bite. The Alfredo was creamy and flavorful, exactly like Mom's usual recipe. I began to relax slightly, thinking maybe I'd been overthinking the situation. We ate in relative pace for about 10 minutes, discussing Charlotte's upcoming graduation ceremony and her job prospects at various hospitals around Phoenix. I was actually starting to enjoy the conversation when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. On Charlotte's plate, mixed in with her seafood pasta, I spotted something that looked exactly like the small herb garnish that had been on my supposedly separate dish. But Charlotte's garnish was sitting right next to a piece of lobster covered in the same sauce that was allegedly different from mine. My heart started racing as the implications hit me. The garnish was identical. The sauce color was identical. Everything about our dishes was identical except for the visible pieces of seafood on theirs. "Charlotte," I said slowly, my voice barely above a whisper, "did you actually make my pasta separately, or did you just pick the lobster pieces out of the same batch?" Charlotte's fork paused halfway to her mouth. For just a split second, I saw something flicker across her face. Guilt, maybe, or fear of being caught. But it was quickly replaced by indignation. "I can't believe you're questioning me again, after everything I did to help you tonight." But I could see the truth in her eyes, in the way she avoided direct eye contact, in the slight trembling of her hand holding the fork. She hadn't made my pasta separately at all. She had simply removed the visible seafood from a portion of the same batch, leaving me to consume a full serving of shellfish-contaminated Alfredo sauce. The realization hit me like a physical blow. My own sister had essentially poisoned me, whether through carelessness or something worse, and I had eaten almost half the plate. I stood up abruptly, my chair scraping against the floor. "I need to go to the bathroom," I managed to say, though my throat was already starting to feel scratchy. By the time I reached the bathroom, my throat was definitely constricting, and I could feel the familiar burning sensation that preceded a full allergic reaction. I had minutes, maybe less, before this became life-threatening. My EpiPen was in my purse, which I had left in the kitchen, and my family, the people who should have been rushing to help me, had no idea that Charlotte's careful preparation was about to kill me.
Standing in my parents' bathroom, I could feel my body betraying me with each passing second. The familiar burn spread through my throat like liquid fire, and my breathing became increasingly labored. My hands were starting to shake as hives erupted across my arms and chest. I had maybe 3 minutes before this reaction became irreversible. I burst out of the bathroom and rushed back toward the kitchen, my vision already starting to blur around the edges. "I need my EpiPen," I gasped, barely able to get the words out through my swelling throat. The scene I returned to was surreal. My family was still calmly eating their dinner, as if I hadn't just stumbled away from the table in obvious distress. Charlotte looked up first, and I saw something flash across her face. Not concern, but what looked almost like satisfaction. "What's wrong now?" Dad asked, not even putting down his fork. "Allergic reaction," I wheezed, grabbing my purse from the counter. My fingers fumbled with the zipper as my coordination began to fail. "Char, the pasta, it wasn't separate!" Charlotte's chair scraped back loudly. "That's impossible. I was extremely careful with the preparation. You're probably just having anxiety because you're so paranoid about food." I finally got my purse open and pulled out my EpiPen, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. The hives were spreading rapidly now, covering my neck and face. My parents were staring at me, but neither made a move to help. "Should we call 911?" Mom asked, but her tone was more annoyed than concerned, as if I was disrupting their pleasant dinner with unnecessary drama. "Yes," I managed to croak, pulling the cap off the EpiPen. But as I raised it toward my thigh, Charlotte suddenly stood up. "Wait," she said, her voice taking on that authoritative tone she used when discussing her medical training. "Elizabeth, you need to calm down first. Panic can mimic allergic reaction symptoms. Let's assess whether this is actually anaphylaxis or just anxiety." I stared at her in disbelief, the EpiPen trembling in my hand. My sister was literally suggesting I wait and see if my allergic reaction was real, while my throat continued to close. The medical knowledge she was so proud of was being weaponized against me in the most dangerous way possible. "Charlotte," I gasped, "I can't breathe." But she stepped closer, reaching for my EpiPen. "As someone with medical training, I think we should evaluate your symptoms more carefully before using emergency medication unnecessarily. EpiPens aren't toys, Elizabeth." That's when something clicked. Through the haze of my reaction, I realized Charlotte wasn't trying to help me. She was trying to prevent me from helping myself. Every instinct I had was screaming that this was intentional, that Charlotte had knowingly given me contaminated food and was now trying to delay my treatment. I jerked the EpiPen away from her reaching hand and jabbed it into my thigh, pressing the trigger. The relief was almost immediate as the epinephrine flooded my system, opening my airways and counteracting the allergic response. But I wasn't out of danger yet. I still needed immediate medical attention. "I'm calling 911, I said, my voice still hoarse, but stronger than it had been moments before. "Absolutely not," Dad said firmly. "We're not having paramedics show up here over something that was clearly an accident. Charlotte tried her best to accommodate your allergy." I looked around the kitchen at my family, really looked at them, and saw their true priorities laid bare. Charlotte was standing with her arms crossed, looking annoyed that I'd used my EpiPen despite her medical advice. Mom was already clearing dishes, as if the emergency was over and we could just return to normal dinner conversation. Dad was shaking his head in disappointment, not at Charlotte for potentially poisoning me, but at me for creating a scene. "I'm driving myself to the hospital," I announced, grabbing my car keys. "Elizabeth, you're being ridiculous," Mom said. "Charlotte is studying to be a nurse practitioner. If she says you're fine, you're fine." But I was already heading for the door. The EpiPen had bought me time, but I knew from previous reactions that I needed medical observation and possibly additional treatment. More importantly, I was beginning to understand that staying in this house any longer might be genuinely dangerous for me. Charlotte followed me to the front door. "You're embarrassing our entire family," she hissed in a low voice only I could hear, "making a huge production over nothing, just like you always do." I turned to face her, and in that moment I made a decision that would change everything. "Nothing?" I said, my voice gaining strength. "Charlotte, you could have killed me tonight." Her face went pale, but she quickly recovered. "That's a serious accusation to make against someone who went out of their way to help you."
"We'll see what the hospital has to say about that," I replied, walking out the door. The drive to Phoenix General Hospital was terrifying. Even with the EpiPen, I could feel residual effects of the reaction. My heart racing, my hands still shaking, a persistent wheeze in my breathing. But worse than the physical symptoms was the emotional realization that my own family had prioritized Charlotte's reputation over my life. In the emergency room, I was immediately triaged and taken back to a treatment bay. The nurse, a middle-aged woman named Sandra, was incredibly kind and professional as she took my vital signs and medical history. "Tell me exactly what happened," she said, preparing an IV line for additional medication. For the first time that evening, someone was actually listening to me.
I explained about the family dinner, Charlotte's offer to help with food preparation, my growing suspicion that the pasta hadn't been prepared separately, and my family's resistance to getting me medical help. Sandra's expression grew increasingly concerned as I spoke. How long between eating the contaminated food and using your EpiPen? Maybe 15 minutes total, but my sister tried to talk me out of using it, said it might just be anxiety. A nursing student told you not to use your EpiPen during an allergic reaction? She said we should wait and assess whether it was really anaphylaxis. The nurse made some notes in my chart, her lips pressed together in a thin line. I'm going to have Dr. Rodriguez come speak with you. We need to document this incident carefully. Dr. Rodriguez was a woman in her 40s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a no-nonsense manner. She examined me thoroughly, asked detailed questions about the timeline of events, and took extensive notes about my family's response to the emergency. Elizabeth, she said finally, I want you to understand something very important. What you described, your sister discouraging you from using your EpiPen during an active allergic reaction, that's not just poor judgment. That's dangerous medical advice that could have killed you. I felt tears starting to form in my eyes. Finally, someone was validating what I'd experienced instead of minimizing it. Dr. Rodriguez continued, I'm required to document incidents like this, especially when there are questions about whether the allergen exposure was accidental. The fact that someone with medical training advised against emergency treatment raises serious concerns. What kind of documentation? I asked. A detailed incident report that will become part of your permanent medical record. If there are any future incidents involving your family members and your allergy, this will establish a pattern. The implications of her words hit me like a physical blow. Dr. Rodriguez wasn't just treating my allergic reaction, she was documenting what could be evidence of intentional harm. Over the next 3 hours, I received IV medications to prevent any rebound reactions and underwent careful monitoring. During that time, I had a lot of opportunity to think about what had happened and what I was going to do about it. By the time I was discharged at midnight, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to let this slide. I wasn't going to accept my family's version of events or pretend this was just an unfortunate accident. Charlotte's actions tonight had been deliberate, and my parents' response had shown me exactly where I stood in their priorities. The hospital gave me copies of all my documentation, including Dr. Rodriguez's detailed incident report and the nurse's notes about my family's concerning behavior. I had proof now, medical evidence, that this wasn't just sibling conflict or family drama. As I drove home to my small apartment across town, I realized that tonight had been a turning point, not just because of the allergic reaction, but because I finally saw my family clearly. The golden child who could do no wrong had tried to seriously harm me, and our parents had immediately chosen to protect her rather than ensure my safety. I wasn't going to forget, and I certainly wasn't going to forgive. Not this time. The real question now was what I was going to do with the truth I uncovered and the evidence I now possessed. Because one thing had become crystal clear. Charlotte's behavior tonight hadn't been a mistake or poor judgment. It had been calculated and intentional. And I was going to prove it. The next morning, I woke up in my studio apartment feeling like I'd been hit by a truck. The after effects of anaphylaxis always left me drained and shaky, but this time, the emotional exhaustion was even worse than the physical symptoms. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the hospital discharge papers on my nightstand, and tried to process what had really happened the night before. My phone had been buzzing since dawn with texts from my family. Mom's messages were a mixture of concern and irritation. Hope you're feeling better. Maybe we can discuss this rationally when you're not so emotional. Dad's were shorter and more direct. Your mother is very upset. Call when you're ready to apologize for the scene last night. But it was Charlotte's messages that made my blood run cold. I'm really hurt that you're making me out to be some kind of villain when I tried so hard to help you. I followed every protocol I learned in school. maybe you should consider that your reaction was psychosomatic. The word psychosomatic stopped me in my tracks. Charlotte was now claiming my life-threatening allergic reaction had been all in my head. This wasn't just denial anymore. This was gaslighting on a dangerous level. I called in sick to work and spent the morning researching. If Charlotte was going to use her medical training to attack my credibility, I needed to arm myself with facts. I started with basic information about shellfish allergies, cross-contamination, and anaphylaxis, but quickly moved into more complex territory, documenting food tampering, gathering evidence of intentional harm, and understanding my legal options. What I learned terrified me. Cases of family members deliberately exposing relatives to allergens were more common than I realized, and they were often dismissed by authorities as accidents or family disputes. The burden of proof was enormous, especially when the perpetrator had medical knowledge and could manipulate the narrative. But I also discovered something encouraging. Hospital documentation carried significant weight in these cases. Dr. Rodriguez's detailed incident report wasn't just a medical record. It was a legal document that could establish a pattern if anything like this happened again. Around noon, I received an unexpected phone call from Mrs. Henderson at the bookstore. "Elizabeth, honey, I heard you were sick today. Is everything all right?" Something in her warm, maternal tone broke through the walls I'd been building all morning. Before I knew it, I was telling her everything. The family dinner, Charlotte's deception, the allergic reaction, my family's response, and the hospital visit. Mrs. Henderson listened without interrupting, occasionally making small sounds of shock or concern. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then Mrs. Henderson said something that changed my perspective entirely. "Elizabeth, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I've been running this bookstore for 37 years, and I've seen a lot of family situations come through these doors. What you're describing isn't sibling rivalry or even favoritism. What Charlotte did was assault. The fact that she tried to prevent you from using your EpiPen makes it attempted murder." The stark legal terms hit me like a physical blow. "Mrs. Henderson, I don't think—" "No, dear, listen. My late husband was a police officer for 25 years before he retired. I know the difference between an accident and intentional harm. And I know that families often protect the perpetrator at the expense of the victim, especially when the golden child is involved." She paused, then continued in a gentler tone. "I also know a lawyer who specializes in these kinds of cases. His name is Marcus Webb, and he helped my niece when she was dealing with a similar situation with her stepmother. Would you like me to call him?" I found myself saying yes before I had fully processed what I was agreeing to. Within an hour, I had an appointment scheduled for the following day with an attorney who specialized in domestic assault cases involving medical conditions. That afternoon, I decided to do something I'd never done before. I started documenting everything systematically. I created a detailed timeline of Charlotte's behavior toward me over the past 2 years, noting incidents I'd previously dismissed as typical sibling meanness. When I laid it all out chronologically, a disturbing pattern emerged.
Charlotte had accidentally used my shampoo that contained coconut oil, knowing I was sensitive to it, resulting in a painful scalp reaction. She'd borrowed my car and returned it with the seats adjusted in a way that aggravated my chronic back problems, claiming she'd forgotten about my injury from a childhood accident. She'd repeatedly made plans for family events at restaurants that couldn't accommodate my dietary restrictions, then acted surprised when I couldn't attend. Each incident individually seemed minor, the kind of thoughtless behavior that could be explained away. But taken together, they showed a clear pattern of Charlotte using my vulnerabilities against me, then playing innocent when confronted. I also started researching Charlotte's nursing program, particularly her coursework in pharmacology and emergency response. What I found made my stomach turn.
Charlotte had recently completed extensive training in allergy management and anaphylaxis response. She knew exactly what cross-contamination could do to someone with my condition. She knew the signs of allergic reactions, and she definitely knew that telling someone not to use their EpiPen during anaphylaxis could be fatal. The more I learned, the more convinced I became that Sunday's incident hadn't been careless food preparation. It had been deliberate poisoning. That evening, I received a surprise visitor. Derek, Charlotte's boyfriend, showed up at my apartment looking nervous and uncomfortable. Derek had always been kind to me, one of the few people in Charlotte's orbit who treated me like a real person rather than an inconvenience. "Elizabeth, can we talk?" he asked. "I heard about what happened last night, and I'm really concerned." We sat in my small living area, and Derek's first words shocked me. "Charlotte's been acting strange lately," he said. "Ever since she failed that pharmacology exam, she's been obsessed with proving how much she knows about medical emergencies. She keeps talking about how she could handle crisis situations better than most paramedics." My heart started racing. "What do you mean?" Derek looked uncomfortable. "Last week, she was going on about how most people don't understand the real dangers of food allergies, how they overreact to minor symptoms. She kept saying that if she ever had to treat someone with allergies, she'd know the difference between a real emergency and panic-induced symptoms." The pieces were falling into place in a way that made me feel sick. "Derek, did she mention me specifically?" He hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "She said you were the perfect example of someone who doesn't understand their own condition, who assumes every little reaction is life-threatening. She said it was dangerous to have people like you carrying EpiPens because you'd use them unnecessarily and waste emergency resources." I felt like I was going to throw up. Charlotte hadn't just deliberately exposed me to allergens. She'd been planning to use me as some kind of test case to prove her medical superiority. Derek continued, his voice getting quieter. "Elizabeth, there's something else. Yesterday, before the family dinner, Charlotte was researching something on her laptop about allergy reactions and legal liability. She closed it really quickly when I walked into the room, but I saw enough to know she was looking at cases where people died from allergy reactions." The room started spinning. Charlotte had researched the legal implications before poisoning me. This wasn't just attempted murder, it was premeditated. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked. Derek's expression was pained. "Because I care about Charlotte, but I can't stand by and watch her hurt people. And because," he paused, struggling with his words, "because I think she's getting worse, more manipulative, more willing to hurt people to get what she wants. I'm scared of what she might do next." After Derek left, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone, torn between terror and determination. I now had witness testimony that Charlotte had premeditated her attack on me. Combined with the hospital documentation and the pattern of previous incidents I'd cataloged, I had the foundation of a real case. But I also knew that pursuing this would mean destroying my family permanently. There would be no going back from accusations of attempted murder, no family dinners or holiday gatherings, no pretending we were a normal family with typical problems. As I prepared for my meeting with the lawyer the next day, I realized that Charlotte had inadvertently given me something valuable: clarity. For the first time in my life, I could see my family situation for what it really was. Not complicated or difficult, but genuinely dangerous. And I was finally ready to do something about it.
My meeting with Marcus Webb was scheduled for Tuesday morning at his downtown Phoenix office. I spent Monday night organizing all my documentation, hospital records, the timeline I'd created, notes from my conversation with Derek, even screenshots of Charlotte's manipulative text messages. I felt prepared, maybe even optimistic that I finally had someone in my corner who could help me get justice. Marcus Webb's office was in a modest building near the courthouse, not the gleaming corporate tower I'd imagined. He was a man in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the sort of calm demeanor that immediately put me at ease. Mrs. Henderson had described him as someone who genuinely cared about his clients rather than just collecting fees, and I could see why within the first 5 minutes of our meeting. "Elizabeth," he said after reviewing all my documentation, "I want you to know that I believe you. What happened to you was serious, and your sister's behavior shows clear intent to harm. The hospital documentation is excellent, and Derek's testimony about premeditation could be crucial." Relief flooded through me. Finally, someone with legal expertise was validating my experience instead of minimizing it. But then his expression grew more serious. "However, I need to be honest with you about the challenges we're facing. Cases involving family members and food allergies are notoriously difficult to prosecute, even with strong evidence." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "The primary challenge is proving intent beyond reasonable doubt. Charlotte can claim this was an accident, that she genuinely believed she was preparing your food safely. She has medical training, which actually works in her favor. She can argue that someone with her knowledge wouldn't deliberately contaminate food because she'd know it could be traced back to her. But Derek said she researched legal liability beforehand. Doesn't that prove premeditation?" Derek's testimony is valuable, but defense attorneys are skilled at creating alternative explanations. They could argue she was researching because she wanted to be extra careful, or that she was studying for school. Without direct evidence that she intentionally contaminated your food, like video footage or a confession, we're relying on circumstantial evidence. I felt my carefully built confidence crumbling. "So Charlotte could literally try to kill me and there's nothing we can do about it?" "I didn't say that," Marcus replied firmly, "but I want you to understand what we're up against so you can make an informed decision about how to proceed." He opened another file folder. "I've been researching similar cases, and here's what typically happens. The family closes ranks around the perpetrator, especially if they're seen as the successful child. Parents often refuse to believe their golden child could do something so serious, and they'll fight any attempts to involve law enforcement or the courts." As if on cue, my phone started buzzing with an incoming call from my mother. I declined it, but Marcus noticed. "Let me guess, family pressure to drop this and move on." I nodded, feeling suddenly exhausted. "They've been calling and texting nonstop. Mom keeps saying I'm destroying the family over a misunderstanding. Dad threatened to cut off any remaining financial support for school if I don't apologize to Charlotte." Marcus made some notes. "That's exactly what I expected. Elizabeth, your family's response is actually evidence in your favor, but it also means you'll be facing enormous pressure to abandon this case. Are you prepared for that?" Before I could answer, my phone buzzed with a text from Charlotte. "I heard you went to a lawyer. This is insane, Elizabeth. I would never hurt you intentionally. Please don't do something we'll both regret." I showed the message to Marcus, and his eyebrows rose. "She knows you're here." Derek must have told her, or maybe my parents found out somehow. Marcus studied the message carefully. "This is interesting phrasing. Something we'll both regret sounds like a veiled threat. I want you to screenshot this and any other messages like it." Over the next hour, Marcus explained the legal process we'd need to follow. First, we could file a police report and request an investigation. If the police found sufficient evidence, they might pursue criminal charges. Simultaneously, we could file a civil lawsuit seeking damages for medical expenses, pain and suffering, and punitive damages. The civil case has a lower burden of proof. We don't need to prove guilt beyond reasonable doubt, just that it's more likely than not that Charlotte intentionally harmed you. But even civil cases involving family members can be brutal. As we wrapped up the meeting, Marcus gave me homework. Continue documenting any concerning behavior, save all communication from family members, and think seriously about whether I was prepared for the emotional and financial cost of pursuing legal action. "Elizabeth, I need you to understand something," he said as I gathered my papers. "Even if we win, you'll likely lose your family permanently. They'll never forgive you for taking legal action against Charlotte. are you prepared for that consequence? I left the law office with more questions than answers and a heavy heart. The validation I'd felt about my experience was now overshadowed by the reality of how difficult it would be to get actual justice. The rest of the week became a nightmare of family pressure and manipulation that made me question my own sanity. My phone rang constantly with calls from relatives I barely knew, all of whom had somehow heard that I was causing problems for Charlotte and wanted to convince me to drop my vendetta. My Aunt Susan, whom I hadn't spoken to in years, left a voicemail saying, "Elizabeth, honey, I know you're upset, but Charlotte is about to graduate nursing school. Do you really want to ruin her career over a cooking mistake?" My cousin Michael texted, "Family sticks together. Whatever happened, I'm sure Charlotte didn't mean it. Don't be the one who destroys this family." But the most devastating call came from my maternal grandmother, a woman I'd always been close to. She called Wednesday evening, her voice shaky with age and emotion. "Elizabeth, sweetheart, your mother is beside herself. She says you're accusing Charlotte of trying to poison you. Surely you don't really believe that?" Hearing my grandmother's disappointed tone broke something inside me. "Grandma, I almost died. Charlotte gave me food contaminated with shellfish and then tried to stop me from using my EpiPen." "Oh, honey, I'm sure it was just an accident. You know how much Charlotte loves you. She'd never hurt you intentionally. Maybe you're remembering things differently because you were scared?" Even my grandmother was gaslighting me, suggesting that my memory of nearly dying was unreliable. The isolation was overwhelming. The final blow came Friday afternoon when I arrived at work to find Mrs. Henderson looking upset. She pulled me aside as soon as I walked in. "Elizabeth, I got a call this morning from your mother. She's very concerned about you, says you're having some kind of breakdown and making wild accusations against your sister." My heart sank. "Mrs. Henderson, you know what really happened. You're the one who suggested I see the lawyer." Her expression was pained. "I know, dear, and I still believe you, but your mother was very persuasive. She mentioned that you'd been under a lot of stress with school and work, that you'd been having some emotional difficulties lately. She's worried you might be exaggerating the situation." I stared at her in shock. "Do you think I'm lying?" "No, I don't think you're lying. But families are complicated, and sometimes when we're hurt, we can interpret things in ways that..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Even Mrs. Henderson, my strongest supporter, was beginning to doubt my version of events. My mother had managed to plant seeds of uncertainty in the mind of the one person who had unequivocally believed me. That evening, I sat in my apartment surrounded by evidence of Charlotte's attack on me, hospital records, documentation, witness statements, and realized that none of it mattered if everyone around me could be convinced I was mentally unstable or vindictive. Charlotte wasn't just getting away with trying to kill me. She was successfully painting me as the problem. The golden child narrative was so strong that, even with medical evidence of her crime, people were more willing to believe I was having a breakdown than to accept that their beloved Charlotte could be dangerous. I called Marcus Webb and told him I wanted to withdraw from pursuing legal action. The cost, emotionally, financially, and socially, was more than I could bear. Charlotte had won, just like she always did. But as I hung up the phone, I realized that giving up felt like dying a different kind of death. If I backed down now, Charlotte would know she could hurt me with impunity. Worse, she might hurt someone else, secure in the knowledge that her family would protect her no matter what she did. The question was, did I have the strength to keep fighting when it felt like the whole world was against me? 3 days after I'd called Marcus Webb to withdraw from the case, I was sitting in my apartment at 2 a.m., unable to sleep, and questioning everything I thought I knew about myself. The isolation was crushing. My family had effectively excommunicated me. Mrs. Henderson was treating me with cautious sympathy rather than genuine support, and I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. That's when I received an unexpected email that would change everything. The sender was someone named Dr. Rebecca Santos from the Arizona Poison Control Center. The subject line read, "Regarding your recent hospital visit, urgent follow-up required."
My hands trembled as I opened the message. Dear Miss Morrison, I am writing regarding the incident report filed after your emergency room visit on March 15th. As part of our routine review of potential poisoning cases, we've identified several concerning factors in your case that warrant further investigation. Please contact me at your earliest convenience. This matter requires immediate attention for public safety reasons. I stared at the email in disbelief. The Poison Control Center had flagged my case independently. I called the number immediately, despite the late hour, and was surprised when Dr. Santos answered personally. Miss Morrison, thank you for calling. I've been reviewing your case, and I need to ask you some detailed questions. What you experienced fits a pattern we've been tracking: cases of deliberate allergen exposure within families, often by individuals with medical training who believe they can control the outcome. My voice caught in my throat. You mean this has happened to other people? More often than you might think, unfortunately. The combination of medical knowledge and family dynamics creates a particularly dangerous situation. Can you tell me exactly what your sister said when she discouraged you from using your EpiPen? I recounted Charlotte's words verbatim, and I could hear Dr. Santos typing notes. Miss Morrison, I need you to understand something critical. Someone with nursing training telling an anaphylaxis victim not to use their emergency medication is not just negligent, it's potentially homicidal. There is no legitimate medical reason to delay epinephrine administration during an allergic reaction. For the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe properly. So I'm not crazy. This really was as serious as I thought it was. You are absolutely not crazy. In fact, your quick thinking in using your EpiPen despite the pressure not to may have saved your life. I'm going to be filing an additional report with law enforcement, and I'd like to connect you with Detective Maria Gonzalez, who specializes in domestic violence cases involving medical abuse. Dr. Santos explained that she'd been building a database of similar cases across the Southwest, and that Charlotte's behavior matched a specific pattern they'd identified. Perpetrators often use their medical knowledge as a weapon, claiming authority over the victim's own understanding of their condition. They also typically escalate when their initial attempts don't achieve the desired outcome. The phrase desired outcome sent chills down my spine. What do you think Charlotte was trying to achieve? That's something we'll need to investigate further. But, Miss Morrison, I want you to know that you're not alone in this anymore. We have resources and expertise that your previous attorney may not have been aware of. After hanging up with Dr. Santos, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. More than that, I felt validation from an objective medical authority who understood the technical aspects of what Charlotte had done to me. The next morning, Detective Maria Gonzalez called. She was a woman with a warm but professional voice who immediately put me at ease. Elizabeth, Dr. Santos shared your case with me, and I want you to know that we take medical abuse within families very seriously. I've investigated several similar cases, and what happened to you shows clear indicators of intentional harm. Detective Gonzalez explained that she'd already begun a preliminary investigation based on the hospital records and poison control report. She's requested Charlotte's academic records from her nursing program, particularly her coursework in allergy management and emergency response. If she receives specific training on anaphylaxis treatment, her advice to delay your EpiPen use becomes even more suspicious.
She also revealed something that shocked me. We've discovered that your sister has been posting on social media about people who overreact to food allergies. Some of her posts specifically mock individuals who carry EpiPens, calling them drama queens who want attention. I felt sick. Charlotte had been publicly mocking people like me while privately planning to use me as some kind of test case. Detective Gonzalez continued, "We're also looking into whether Derek's testimony about Charlotte's research into legal liability constitutes evidence of premeditation. If we can prove she researched the potential consequences before acting, that significantly strengthens our case." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had professional allies who understood the complexity of what I'd experienced. Dr. Santos and Detective Gonzalez weren't dismissing my concerns or suggesting I was overreacting. They were treating Charlotte's actions as the serious crimes they were. But the real transformation came during my second meeting with Detective Gonzalez later that week. She'd uncovered information that completely shifted my understanding of the situation. "Elizabeth, we've been investigating your sister's background more thoroughly, and we've discovered something concerning. Charlotte has been involved in 2 other incidents during her nursing clinicals where patients experienced unexpected complications during her care." My blood ran cold. What kind of complications? In both cases, patients with documented allergies or medical conditions experienced adverse reactions while under her supervision. The incidents were initially attributed to human error or patient non-compliance, but the pattern is troubling. Detective Gonzalez spread out several documents on the table. "We've also found evidence that Charlotte has been researching various medical conditions extensively, not just allergies, but also diabetes management, cardiac conditions, and medication interactions, far beyond what would be normal for her level of training." The implications hit me like a physical blow. "You think she's been experimenting on people? We think your sister may have a pathological need to control medical emergencies and prove her superiority over both patients and other medical professionals. What happened to you might not have been an isolated incident. It might have been part of a pattern of increasingly dangerous behavior." Detective Gonzalez leaned forward, her expression serious. "Elizabeth, I need you to understand that this investigation has grown beyond just your case. We're now looking at whether Charlotte poses an ongoing threat to public safety, particularly as she approaches graduation and enters professional practice." The weight of this revelation was staggering. My personal family drama had become a criminal investigation into potential serial medical abuse. "There's something else," Detective Gonzalez said. "We've been monitoring Charlotte's communications, and she's been in contact with your parents about ways to manage this situation. Some of her messages suggest she's planning to claim you have mental health issues that make your testimony unreliable." I thought about my mother's call to Mrs. Henderson and realized Charlotte had been orchestrating the campaign to undermine my credibility. It wasn't just family loyalty. It was a calculated strategy to discredit me as a witness. Detective Gonzalez handed me a card. "I'm connecting you with Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a forensic psychologist who specializes in evaluating victims of family abuse. She'll be able to provide documentation that your mental state is completely normal and that your account of events is consistent and credible." As I left the police station, I realized that everything had changed. This was no longer about getting justice for what Charlotte had done to me. It was about protecting other people from what she might do next. The personal had become public, and my decision to pursue the truth might prevent other families from experiencing what mine had gone through. But more importantly, I had finally found my strength. For weeks, I'd been allowing other people to define my reality, to tell me what had happened to me and how I should feel about it. Now, with the backing of medical experts, law enforcement, and forensic professionals, I was reclaiming my own narrative. Charlotte had underestimated me. She'd assumed that the family dynamics that had always worked in her favor would continue to protect her, even from the consequences of attempted murder. She'd counted on my isolation, my self-doubt, and my desire to maintain family relationships at any cost. But I wasn't the same person who had walked into that family dinner 3 weeks ago. I'd been transformed by the experience of nearly dying and then fighting for the truth in the face of systematic gaslighting. I'd learned that my voice mattered, that my experience was valid, and that I had the right to demand justice even when it was inconvenient for everyone else. The scared, apologetic daughter who always deferred to her golden child sister was gone. In her place was someone who understood her own worth and was willing to fight for it.
The confrontation I'd been both dreading and anticipating finally came on a Thursday morning in early April. I was at work, helping Mrs. Henderson inventory new arrivals, when Detective Gonzalez called with news that would set everything in motion. "Elizabeth, we're ready to make an arrest. We've gathered enough evidence to charge Charlotte with aggravated assault and reckless endangerment. But before we proceed, there's something we need from you." My hands started shaking as I gripped the phone. "What do you need?" "We want to arrange a controlled meeting between you and Charlotte with recording equipment. We need her to make statements about the incident that we can use in court. Are you willing to do that?" The thought of facing Charlotte directly, Knowing what I now knew about her pattern of behavior terrified me. But I also knew this was my chance to get her to reveal the truth in her own words. What would I have to do? Detective Gonzalez explained the plan. They would set up the meeting at a neutral location with hidden cameras and audio equipment. I would confront Charlotte about what had happened, guided by questions designed to elicit incriminating responses. 2 undercover officers would be positioned nearby in case Charlotte became violent. Elizabeth, I want you to understand that this is completely voluntary, but Charlotte's narcissism and need to be seen as medically superior might lead her to say things that confirm our suspicions about her motives. I agreed to the meeting, and we scheduled it for the following Monday at a coffee shop near Arizona State University. Detective Gonzalez spent the weekend coaching me on how to guide the conversation and what specific admissions would be most valuable for their pace. The morning of the meeting, I arrived at the coffee shop early, my heart pounding so hard I was sure everyone could hear it. The recording equipment was invisible, hidden in my purse and jacket, but I felt like I was wearing a neon sign announcing my deception. Charlotte walked in exactly on time, looking every inch the responsible nursing student in her scrubs from a clinical rotation. She approached my table with a concerned expression that would have fooled me completely just a month ago. "Elizabeth, thank you for agreeing to meet. I've been so worried about you." She sat down across from me, reaching out as if to take my hand. "I know you've been going through a really difficult time, and I want you to know that I don't blame you for lashing out at me." The calculated nature of her opening statement was stunning. She was immediately positioning herself as the concerned sister and me as the unstable one having a difficult time. "Charlotte," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "I need you to tell me exactly what happened that night at dinner. Walk me through how you prepared my food." Her expression shifted slightly, becoming more guarded. "Elizabeth, we've been over this. I was extremely careful to follow proper protocols to prevent cross-contamination. I used separate utensils, separate pans, everything I learned in my training. But my reaction was severe, life-threatening. How do you explain that if you were so careful?" Charlotte leaned back in her chair, and for just a moment I saw a flicker of something cold in her eyes before the concerned sister mask slipped back into place. "Honestly, I think you might have psychosomatic responses to situations where you think you've been exposed to allergens. It's more common than people realize, especially in individuals who have a history of anxiety around their medical conditions." The casual way she dismissed my near-death experience as psychological was chilling, but I pressed forward with the questions Detective Gonzalez had coached me to ask. "Charlotte, why did you tell me not to use my epinephrine pen? You know that epinephrine is the first line of treatment for anaphylaxis." Her composure cracked slightly. "I wanted to make sure you were actually experiencing anaphylaxis before you used emergency medication unnecessarily. A lot of people with allergies panic and assume the worst when they might just be having minor symptoms." But I was having major symptoms. My throat was closing, I had hives everywhere, I could barely breathe. Charlotte's voice took on a lecturing tone that I recognized from her discussions about her nursing classes. "Elizabeth, I've seen real anaphylaxis in clinical settings. What you were experiencing looked more like an anxiety response. Someone with my training knows the difference." There it was. Her need to assert her medical superiority was overriding her self-preservation instincts. She was essentially admitting that she'd decided my life-threatening symptoms weren't real and had acted on that assumption. "So, you made a medical judgment about my condition and decided I shouldn't use my prescribed emergency medication?" "I made an educated assessment based on my clinical training, yes. I was trying to prevent you from overreacting to what might have been anxiety symptoms." I took a deep breath and asked the question that Detective Gonzalez had said was most important. "Charlotte, have you ever researched what happens legally when someone dies from an allergic reaction?" Her entire demeanor changed.
The mask of concern disappeared completely, replaced by something calculating and cold.
Why would you ask me that? Because Derek said you were researching legal liability the day before our family dinner. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, her mind clearly racing. When she spoke again, her voice was different, harder, more honest than I'd ever heard it. Elizabeth, do you have any idea how many people fake severe allergic reactions for attention? How many resources are wasted on people who think every little tingle means they're dying? I've seen it in my clinicals constantly. So you decided to test whether my allergy was real? The question hung in the air between us. Charlotte stared at me, and I could see her weighing her response. Her narcissism was warring with her survival instincts. I knew you'd be fine. People with real severe allergies don't usually make it to adulthood without learning to manage their condition properly. I figured if you actually went into anaphylaxis, you use your EpiPen regardless of what I said. The fact that you hesitated proved my point about it being psychological. My blood turned to ice. She was admitting that she deliberately exposed me to allergens to prove a point about my mental state. So you intentionally contaminated my food? Charlotte's eyes flashed with anger. I gave you the same pasta everyone else was eating. If you were truly as allergic as you claimed to be, you would have been more careful about what you consumed. Charlotte, you told me it was prepared separately. You lied to me about the safety of the food. I told you what you needed to hear to stop being paranoid and dramatic. If you'd had a real reaction, you would have used your EpiPen immediately instead of running around making a scene. The confession was everything Detective Gonzalez had hoped for and more. Charlotte had admitted to deliberate deception, medical abuse, and using me as an unwilling test subject for her theories about fake allergies. But she wasn't done. Her need to justify her actions was leading her to reveal even more. Elizabeth, you have no idea how frustrating it is to watch someone get attention and sympathy for a condition that might not even be real. Do you know how many actual medical emergencies I've dealt with in my clinicals? Real emergencies, not someone having a panic attack because they think they might have eaten something. Are you saying my shellfish allergy isn't real? I'm saying I've never seen definitive proof that you have the severe reaction you claim to have. That incident when we were kids could have been anything: food poisoning, anxiety, viral illness. But ever since then, you've used this supposed allergy to control family situations and get special treatment. The depth of her resentment and the calculated nature of her attack on me was breathtaking. She had essentially been planning this test for years, waiting for an opportunity to prove that I was faking my medical condition for attention. Charlotte, I almost died that night. The hospital confirmed I was in anaphylaxis. She laughed, actually laughed. Hospital staff see what they expect to see. You came in claiming allergic reactions, so they treated you for allergic reaction. It doesn't mean their diagnosis was accurate. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Charlotte revealing more about her mindset and her actions. She admitted to researching my condition extensively, to planning the dinner specifically to test her theories, and to being frustrated when I overreacted by going to the hospital. By the time we parted ways, I had everything Detective Gonzalez needed. Charlotte had admitted to deliberate deception, medical abuse, and using me as an unwilling test subject for her theories about fake allergies. And she had revealed a disturbing pattern of thinking that suggested she saw other people as objects for her experimentation rather than human beings deserving of care and respect. As I walked back to my car, I felt a strange mixture of triumph and sadness. I'd gotten the confession that would ensure Charlotte faced consequences for her actions, but I'd also heard, in her own words, just how much she despised me and how little my life meant to her. The sister I'd grown up with, the person I'd spent years trying to please and impress, saw me nothing more than a test subject for her medical theories.
There was no love there, no family bond, just cold calculation and barely concealed contempt. But I'd finally gotten the truth. And now, Charlotte was going to face the consequences of what she had done not just to me, but potentially to other patients under her care. The final push was complete. Now came the reckoning.
Charlotte Morrison was arrested at Arizona State University's nursing program headquarters on April 8th, during what was supposed to be her final semester before graduation. I wasn't there to witness it, but Detective Gonzalez called me immediately afterward to let me know that the arrest had gone smoothly and that Charlotte was being charged with aggravated assault, reckless endangerment, and practicing medicine without a license. The recording from your meeting was exactly what we needed, Detective Gonzalez told me. Her confession, combined with the evidence we'd already gathered, makes this case ironclad. The district attorney is confident we can secure a conviction. The news should have felt like victory, but mostly I felt empty. After weeks of fighting for the truth, the actual moment of vindication was anticlimactic. Charlotte was facing serious criminal charges, but that didn't undo the trauma of nearly dying or the months of gaslighting that followed. The media attention was immediate and overwhelming. Local news outlets picked up the story of a nursing student arrested for poisoning her sister with food allergens, and it quickly became a cautionary tale about medical abuse and family dysfunction. I found myself at the center of a media storm I hadn't anticipated, with reporters calling constantly and news vans occasionally parked outside my apartment building. My parents' reaction was exactly what I'd expected. They hired an expensive criminal defense attorney for Charlotte and issued a statement through their lawyer claiming I was a troubled young woman seeking attention and that Charlotte was being persecuted for trying to help her mentally unstable sister. The family had closed ranks completely, painting me as the villain even in the face of recorded confessions and expert testimony. The trial took place 6 months later, in October. By then, the investigation had uncovered even more disturbing information about Charlotte's behavior during her nursing clinicals. 3 additional patients came forward with accounts of suspicious incidents during Charlotte's care, including a diabetic patient who experienced a dangerous blood sugar drop after Charlotte allegedly miscalculated insulin dosage, and an elderly cardiac patient who suffered complications after Charlotte administered medication that contradicted his chart. The prosecution painted a picture of someone who saw patients as opportunities to test their medical theories rather than human beings deserving compassionate care. Dr. Santos testified about the pattern of medical abuse within families, particularly cases where the perpetrator used their medical knowledge to manipulate and control victims. Detective Gonzalez presented the recorded confession, which was played in full for the jury. Charlotte's defense team tried to argue that she'd been trying to help me overcome what she genuinely believed was a psychological aversion to certain foods, not a real allergy. They brought in character witnesses who testified to her academic excellence and dedication to healthcare. But the recording was damning, particularly the parts where Charlotte laughed about my near-death experience and admitted to deliberately deceiving me about food safety. The most powerful moment in the trial came when Derek took the stand. Charlotte's own boyfriend testified about her research into legal liability before the dinner, her obsession with proving people faked medical conditions, and her disturbing comments about using patients as test subjects to prove her medical superiority. She would talk about patients like they were puzzles to solve rather than people to care for, Derek testified. She seemed to enjoy situations where she could prove that someone's condition wasn't as serious as they claimed. Derek's testimony destroyed any remaining credibility Charlotte might have had. Here was someone who loved her, testifying that her behavior toward me was part of a broader pattern of seeing people as objects for her experimentation. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Charlotte Morrison was found guilty on all charges. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 3 years. More significantly for her future, she was permanently banned from working in any healthcare capacity, and her nursing school expelled her just weeks before graduation. My parents didn't speak to me throughout the entire trial process. They sat in the courtroom supporting Charlotte, glaring at me when I testified about the years of favoritism and the night she nearly killed me. When the verdict was announced, my mother actually sobbed as if Charlotte were the victim, not me.
After the sentencing, I found myself standing outside the courthouse with Mrs. Henderson, who had attended every day of the trial to support me. She put her arm around my shoulders as we watched my parents drive away without acknowledging my presence. "How do you feel, dear?" she asked. I thought about the question seriously. "Free," I said finally. For the first time in my life, I feel free. The aftermath of the trial was both liberating and challenging. I had to rebuild my entire sense of family and belonging. The Morrisons had made it clear that seeking justice for Charlotte's actions meant permanent exile from their world. There would be no reconciliation, no acknowledgement that I'd been right to pursue the truth, no apology for years of favoritism and the months of gaslighting that followed my near-death experience. But I discovered that losing a toxic family opened space for a chosen family that actually valued me. Mrs. Henderson became the mother figure I'd always needed, someone who celebrated my achievements and supported me through difficulties without constantly comparing me to someone else. Dr. Santos became a mentor, helping me understand the broader implications of medical abuse and connecting me with support groups for survivors of family violence.
Marcus Webb, the attorney I'd initially consulted, reached out after the trial to apologize for his initial pessimism about the case and to offer his services pro bono if I wanted to pursue a civil lawsuit against Charlotte. "You were braver than most people would have been in your situation," he told me, "and you likely saved other people from experiencing what you went through." That comment led to one of the most meaningful developments in my recovery. I began volunteering with an organization that supported victims of medical abuse, particularly cases involving family members. My experience with Charlotte had taught me how to recognize the signs of medical manipulation and how to navigate the complex emotions that come with being victimized by someone who's supposed to love you. Through this volunteer work, I met Sarah Chen, a woman whose husband had been secretly tampering with her diabetes medication as a form of control. Her story was different from mine in the details, but identical in the fundamental dynamics. A person with medical knowledge using that knowledge to harm someone they claimed to love, then convincing everyone around them that the victim was unstable or lying. "The hardest part isn't the physical danger," Sarah told me during one of our conversations. "It's the way everyone assumes that family members wouldn't hurt each other intentionally. They'll believe any explanation except the truth." Working with other survivors helped me understand that Charlotte's behavior wasn't about me personally. It was about power and control. She would have found ways to manipulate and harm anyone in my position, because the need to prove her superiority was more important to her than basic human decency. A year after Charlotte's conviction, I made a decision that would have been unthinkable during my childhood. I changed my last name. Elizabeth Morrison became Elizabeth Santos, honoring the doctor who had first validated my experience and helped me find the strength to seek justice. The name change felt like shedding an old skin, leaving behind the family dynamics that had nearly destroyed me. I finished my community college program with a focus on social work and transferred to Arizona State University, ironically the same institution where Charlotte had been pursuing her nursing degree. But I was studying victim advocacy and trauma counseling, preparing for a career helping other people navigate situations similar to what I had experienced. On graduation day, Mrs. Henderson sat in the audience cheering for me, along with Dr. Santos, Detective Gonzalez, and several friends I'd made through my volunteer work. It was a smaller crowd than some families, but every person there genuinely cared about my success and well-being. The Morrison family was not represented. I learned through mutual acquaintances that my parents had moved to a different city, apparently unable to handle the social consequences of having raised a daughter who attempted murder. They never reached out to congratulate me on graduation or to acknowledge any of the achievements I had accomplished in the years following Charlotte's conviction. Sometimes people ask if I miss having a traditional family, if I regret pursuing justice against Charlotte, knowing it would cost me my parents and extended family relationships. The answer is always no. The family I was born into was built on favoritism, manipulation, and the willingness to sacrifice one child to protect another. That's not love. That's dysfunction masquerading as loyalty. The family I've chosen, Mrs. Henderson, Dr. Santos, the friends and colleagues who actually see and value me, that's real love.
It's based on mutual respect, genuine care, and the understanding that love doesn't require sacrifice of truth or safety. Today, I work as a victim advocate specializing in medical abuse cases. I help people navigate the complex legal and emotional challenges that come with being harmed by someone in a position of trust. Every case I work gives me an opportunity to be the support person I wish I'd had during the darkest moments of my own experience. Charlotte will be eligible for parole soon, but she'll never be allowed to work in healthcare again. Sometimes I wonder if she's learned anything from her experience, if she understands the harm she caused, not just to me, but to the other patients who suffered under her care. Mostly, though, I don't think about her at all. My life now is full of people who celebrate my successes, support me through challenges, and would never use my vulnerabilities against me. I have a career that gives me purpose and relationships built on authenticity rather than obligation. The scared young woman who walked into her parents' house for dinner that March evening no longer exists. In her place is someone who knows her worth, trusts her instincts, and understands that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior, even when that behavior comes from family. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is walking away from people who see your existence as inconvenient. Sometimes justice requires losing everything you thought mattered to gain everything that actually does. I almost died that night from anaphylaxis, but in many ways, that near-death experience gave me life. Real life, authentic relationships, and the understanding that I deserve to be safe, valued, and loved for who I actually am. And that's worth fighting for, no matter what it costs.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.